When someone's laughing or creates an environment for laughter, what does it do? It allows stress to decrease. And if stress decreases in a meeting, you're more likely to feel a little bit more open, especially over time.
Welcome to the podcast about communication in business. I'm your host, George Torok. I'm known as the speech coach for executives because I help business leaders deliver the intended message for greater success. And we do that through one-on-one coaching and training for the team. My guest today is George Rivera. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about George. 1, he is a member of Toastmasters International and has been so for the past 26 years. He's currently serving as District 46 Director this year, and for District 46 includes north of 34th Street through Westchester, New York City. And for someone who's never been there, I haven't a clue what that means. So if you don't, we've got something in common there. 2, he is a behavior analyst has been for the last 20 years, serving families, school districts, and hospitals in the tri-state area. And 3, George is not just all serious. He's some fun too. He's been cast and has performed in a few Broadway productions, including Assassins, now that's a part I want to play, Bellevue sketches, and Man of La Mancha. I remember Man of La Mancha. George Rivera, welcome to Your Intended Message.
Thank you, George, for having me on your show. I'm really excited to be here, and I can't thank you enough for your generosity and your time and your support today. Looking forward to the conversation.
George, I'm glad to be talking with you, and I know that you have some wonderful insights and perspective to offer our listeners. You are a behavior analyst. And is that simply a matter of saying this is good behavior, that's bad behavior? Does it go deeper than that?
It does go deeper than that. We actually never use the term good or bad. There's a function for every single thing we say, we do, and we don't do. So things are put into perspective via observation and active listening and being able to really key in on the functions of either language or behaviors.
Which comes first, language or behavior?
As a behaviorist, language is behavior. So that's a pretty cool thing. So what comes first is why. What happens before the thought, before you say something or do something, or before you don't do something, such as avoiding a conversation or escaping a conversation you happen to be involved with and you just don't want to be there. So it's the why, the functionality of the behavior.
Now that's, you hit home there because I can think of some conversations I know I have avoided or put off for a long time because I just didn't want to face that issue because I knew it was going to be difficult, uncomfortable. How do we get past that?
I think it's always about the consequences, the perceived consequences of why we want to escape it or why we want to avoid it. And consequences typically means anything, any result of what our perceptions are of that conversation. Sometimes they are a lot worse than they think that they are. And once we go through it, we oftentimes realize, hey, I made it through this. Why do I keep wanting to avoid this? And other times there are some past events that will shape our predetermined perception of what outcome could happen. So I think it's all about the perceived consequence and how we as humans walk the earth and go, okay, let's find a way to self-soothe prior to having this. And there are many different strategies we could use and implement for self-soothing.
Now, that's interesting. I could use some of that psychology right now, George. How can I self-soothe myself before I enter into a difficult conversation? Difficult for any number of reasons.
A very simple technique is a time travel exercise. It's a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy exercise. And you could implement this by taking a few minutes to just think it through completely before you pick up the phone, the type of conversation you're anticipating having, your intended response, and hanging up the phone. It doesn't end there. After you go through this mental exercise, you actually take the call. And when you take that call, you do a comparative analysis, which is the most important part of this exercise, which is after the reflection. You take 30 seconds to 2 minutes and think about, did that match up with what I thought it was? Did it go a lot better than I thought it did? And the reflection portion, which could be recorded either via audio, it could be recorded in writing in a journal, can then be banked as a reference for the next time that you think about a difficult conversation, either with this individual or other individuals.
Now, that's an interesting exercise. So first we envision how we want it to go, right down to perhaps playing the characters with the voice, the conversations, the words that we want it to go. That gets us in the zone to have the conversation. And then after, we actually look back and say, well, what really happened? How did that compare to what I envisioned? And maybe what could I have done differently?
Even better, you bring in some of the more nuanced or conflictive past moments and infuse that into your exercise and think about ways you can respond prior, anticipating this person's patterns and typical behavior. So you could do both. You could think about the best case scenario and how it could go, but then you could also become a realist and say, typically when I talk to John, he responds this way. Let me infuse that into this mental activity so that I am aware and I can decompress myself and self-soothe and be more relaxed, anticipating that this could happen. And now I have a more organized thought process in my responding. I have a more calm demeanor in my responding.
And if I'm planning to talk to you, and I know it's going to be a difficult conversation, if I'm thinking about what you've done in the past, and if I envision you doing that, I can prepare myself for the trauma of you attacking me in whatever way, so that when it happens, it's not traumatic at all. It's kind of like, well, this was in the play. This is what I saw in the script. So now I know I don't have to be thrown off by that negative behavior and act in a negative way and say, well, it's not my fault. He made me angry.
George, you nailed it. Another thing that it does, it allows you to be responsive and acknowledge the other person's perspective a lot more accurately. So if you just go into this thing hot and you just know that the person's going to piss you off, if you work on this strategy, this allows you to coordinate a different type of message, to be responsive in a different type of way. And most importantly, to infuse a little empathy and understanding that you probably lacked the last 10 times you had this conversation.
Definitely. And I'm going to listen to this again and take notes and say, okay, George, you heard what the man said. You know what to do now. Get ready. Yeah, and pay attention. George, one of the points that you also talk about is how to encourage leadership in their conversation, in their communication. One, how to encourage and how they can be more willing to lead, perhaps when times are difficult. What do you see around that to enhance their ability? What can they do? What can happen around them?
What can they do? What can leaders do? Leaders can be aware of the environment, more aware of the environment. And this means that there are environmental factors that impact communication and ultimately the success of that team, that company, that structure, that vision, the mission. So I think it really keys on the environment. And that as an analyst, it's part of my job. When I walk in, it's not just the conversation and the communication. The first thing that I am observing is what is the environment that this individual or team of individuals, what are they dealing with? What do the walls say? Meaning what's up and around? What's the lighting like? What space do they have to work with? Is it fluid? Are there opportunities for the environment to enhance and support the vision? So as a leader, it's the first thing that I'm looking at versus going right to the source of what the perceived problem is. And most importantly, sometimes the environment is me, the leader himself.
Mm. So give us a little bit more insight into what other factors make up the environment.
So the factors that make up the environment include, let's say, how the structure of or the systems of a communication that your team perhaps has. Is it just email? Do they have an opportunity to speak to people in person? Do they intermessage? Is it an intermessaging system? Is there an opportunity to speak live, especially with all the technology? And people think that you could be off screen and all you see are, we have this on camera meeting, yet they're off camera. So how does that play a role in the interconnectedness of the team? So that I would roll into the environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of a networking meeting that I attended recently, and in my opinion, there were too many people in a room that was too small, which meant one, it was cramped and difficult to move around, and two, small room. Soon as people start talking, it was terribly noisy. So what do people do? They talk louder because they try to get above the noise. And I'm standing there and I'm thinking, and I'm talking to one person there, and she said to me, and I could tell that she was totally stressed because she just didn't like the environment. She said, I have to get out of this room. I can't stand this room. And I didn't enjoy it either. And one person I'm talking to says, I'm noticing that my throat's getting sore. Why do you think it is? Well, because we're all talking way too loud.
Yeah, that's a very good example.
And that's part of the environment that person might not normally think about. And then I'm thinking about, now you mentioned the why, and you talked about what happened before. I'm reminded of a time I was asked to speak at a company event, and I was delivering a program on presentation skills. And however, unbeknownst to me, until I arrived that morning, the president of the company announced layoffs. And now here's your motivational speaker. Not a good setup.
I'm sorry.
So those are environmental factors that people might not consider, because you think that all it is about what you say and how you say, but what's happening around you and what's going on in people's minds.
When you talk about people's minds, it leads me to the psychological safety which the environment produces. And that is one of the biggest factors of the environment. This could be the difference between the growth of your company and the death of your company. Bottom line, if people do not feel safe, they're less likely to take risks. They're less likely to share ideas. They're less likely to be their authentic selves. So as a leader, you have to think about the ways you create the sense of safety in the environment first. So, for example, encouraging open communication, fostering an environment of trust, vulnerability. Here's an example. So a leader could have team meetings that are in person, if they are or online, and ask everyone to just share one thing they're comfortable with and one thing that they're not. This helps you understand exactly where your team members are coming from. And it creates a plan to address any concerns. Now, if you do this out of the blue and you haven't been doing this for the last 10 years, it's going to feel a little strange and it might not feel so safe. So there has to be things that you do prior to prime the pump for this sort of environment.
So I'm okay. So I can see, tell us something that you're comfortable about, some good news, something, something at home, maybe what you did on the weekend, maybe shopping you did. But I can also see people saying, what? If I'm not comfortable with it, why would I tell these people? How did they get past that? And because that is being open to criticism, judgment?
So it's such a good question, George. As a behavior analyst, one of the things we do to introduce we use the term intervention, is fading things in and fading things out. So fading things in that serve us and fade things out that do not serve us. That is critical in any new design. So I wouldn't just go in if there is an environment that is not feeling so safe and you don't feel rewarded for being vulnerable. You don't want to just be vulnerable. You want to take a topic that is relevant in your company's culture today and start teasing this idea. And you do this with the leader doing it first. So if the leader does this first and no one else does it, then you start introducing a method that starts conveying to the team, hey, something's changing a little bit. And if they see that the CEO or the leader is doing this first, they're more likely to start understanding the direction that we're going in. And so, for example, in a timeline, you start a meeting where the leader just does this alone and maybe invites one person to do this. Then the next meeting, the leader does it again, invites 3 or 4 people to do this. So that would be a fading in. And as a result, you're now fading out the feelings of insecurity, the feelings of not feeling so trustworthy.
And give us an example. What have you seen of how where a leader might start in a way without seeming yucky or just what a loser?
I think you see, both of us are laughing. Humor is a wonderful way to do this. And it doesn't have to be long. It could just be one thing. And typically self-deprecating humor is the way to go. You infuse a little bit of humor and there's sort of like a shift, a gentle nudge where everyone's like, wait, I'm actually paying attention now, right? So it does quite a few things. It starts shifting the environment, and now they're really paying attention to some of the things you want to say, at least for a little while. When members feel safe, brain releases dopamine. That's the bottom line. And it's a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward. So when someone's laughing or creates an environment for laughter, what does it do? It allows stress to decrease. And if stress decreases in a meeting, you're more likely to feel a little bit more open, especially over time.
And I'm reminded of a incident that happened when my kids were small. They all played soccer, and I enjoyed going to the soccer games to watch them. And I was at one game watching my youngest daughter, Stacy, play. And while I'm there, I ran into a colleague, a business colleague, and then we realized that our daughters were on opposing teams. And so he says to me, he says, George, which one is yours? And I point towards the field, and I said, the one with the ponytail. And he started laughing. And I'm saying, what's the matter? He says, George, they all have ponytails.
Right.
But I was so focused on my daughter that's the only one I saw. And so I've used that story in a positive way because it shows how our perspective determines what we see. We're both looking at the same field. I saw one person with a ponytail. He saw a field of ponytails. And there's a story. A story could be that simple. It doesn't have to be terribly embarrassing, but it does reveal a little flaw and it creates humor.
It does. You got me on that one. Yep.
So this whole concept of environment affecting the communication, where does that come from?
George, that's such a good question. It comes from the science of how interconnectedness and collaboration supports a diverse environment. It comes from years and years, hundreds of years of research. But for me personally, this all came together on a family trip to Puerto Rico this past summer. And here we are trying to decide which excursion all the boys would agree to. Imagine that conversation. So I just sat back and I watched and listened. And they concluded that they wanted to do kayaking at night because the feature would be this bioluminescent bay of things glowing in the dark. Dark water, George, is not my deal, especially in Puerto Rico, especially in places that are not really familiar to me. And we decided, so what, Dad? You're going to do this anyway. So I went along with this, and the preparation made me even more fearful. We had to put on these vests, and the leaders were the only ones that had light. And we had to do this with a bunch of strangers. So there were about 20 different kayaks, and we had to find a way to stick together. And here's where it all happened. It started in the pitch darkness with these mangrove trees protecting this bay we were trying to get to have the fun. These mangrove trees are very, very interesting because their root system grows from on top. So in the dark, we're kayaking, through this maze for over a mile of branches that we could see, where we only relied on the group leader. So right away, it didn't calm me. My anxiety just increased by another jump. After a mile of this, of tension, anxiety, a complete calmness settled into me as we opened up into this huge bay. The bay in diameter had to be about 4 miles. That's how big this bay was, surrounded by these beautiful mangrove trees. And the only light we had was this starlight. And then the leader says, in order to see the light, we have to make it even darker. So he puts this tarp over the kayaks, and now it's pitch dark. And when it's pitch dark, he asks everyone to dip their hands in the water and move it around. And when this happens, now we see this organism called a dinoflagellate starting to glow and get excited. And he was like, bring the water into the kayak. And I yelled to the kids, not too much now, because I have no idea what's in there. I'm not doing that. So here, everybody's splashing water, and these organisms are just glowing. Little specks are glowing. And what I've come to learn, George, after research, after this all ended, was the mangrove trees provided the ideal environment, temperature-wise, acidity-wise, protection from other elements like humans and animal-wise, so that these amazing, magical organisms could not only survive, but thrive. I had a breakthrough, George, and since that day, I have been off to the races, collecting data, understanding how the environment truly, truly supports this amazing environment of organisms that communicate so amazingly.
And George, what a wonderfully colorful description you gave there, because I'm envisioning that experience that you went through. I can see it and I can feel it. And you gave a great example of how to describe an experience. And for those who'd like to know more about George, how to contact him, you can find the link to his LinkedIn profile below. Do reach out to him. He encourages your connection. George, as we prepare to wrap up, if you could sit down with a team leader and you could offer them 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice on how they can create that environment, how they can be that positive mango tree to create the environment for people to shine, what might be those 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice?
The very first thing is the acknowledgement and the awareness that you as the leader are the primary part of the environment that you are leading. So don't look outward, look inward. What role do you as the leader play in the environment you are trying to help? Number 2, you want to encourage open and honest communication. So you want to foster this, and it doesn't happen from one week to the next. There is a fading in and fading out process of this. And lastly, number 3, if you are fostering collaboration and interconnectedness like a mangrove tree, you are going to create a diverse, collaborative, and communicate and just amazing communication amongst your team members. And what this does, it promotes community and a shared purpose. When you have that environment, stress levels go down. Whether you have introverted members or extroverted members, they tend to balance out and work together. So that would be the 3 things. And I know each leader has that in them to do this.
Positive advice. My guest today is George Rivera, reminding you that before you have that difficult conversation, take the time travel trip. If you like what you heard, tell your friends and post your 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, because that helps more listeners find us. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you deliver your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.